There is a law being discussed in one of the world's most powerful legislative bodies that could make installing Linux on your personal computer a finable offense. It's not a terms of service violation, not a corporate policy breach. A government-enforced financial penalty that could reach $10 million. And the people pushing this law are not fringe actors or technophobes with a grudge against open-source software. They are legislators responding to lobbying from some of the most powerful technology companies on Earth. This is not hypothetical. The legislative framework exists. The lobbying money is documented. The proposed mechanisms have been publicly discussed in committee. And if this law passes in the form its most aggressive proponents are pushing for, the legal right to choose what operating system runs on hardware you own and paid for could disappear, not just in one country, but through the kind of international regulatory alignment that turns one nation's law into every nation's standard. Here is the argument being made by the people who want this law. Cybersecurity, specifically. The argument that unregulated operating systems, meaning operating systems that have not been certified by an approved authority, vetted by approved auditors, and maintained according to approved security standards, represent a national security risk. The framing is seductive. In a world of ransomware attacks, state-sponsored hacking, and critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, who could argue against better security standards for operating systems? The answer is everyone who understands what those standards would actually require in practice. Certification regimes for operating systems do not evaluate whether the software is secure. They evaluate whether the software meets the criteria defined by the certification body. And certification bodies are not neutral technical organizations operating in a vacuum. They are institutions that reflect the interests of the entities that fund them, lobby them, and staff them. In the technology sector, those entities are overwhelmingly large proprietary software companies whose business models depend on the continued dominance of their certified products. A certification requirement for operating systems would not make Linux illegal directly. It would make uncertified Linux illegal in the certification process, with its costs, its timelines, its documentation requirements, and its compliance overhead would be structurally inaccessible to the open-source development model that makes Linux what it is. Major Linux distributions like Ubuntu, Fedora, and RHEL could potentially navigate certification for their enterprise tiers. The cost would be enormous, but survivable for distributions backed by corporations like Canonical, Red Hat, and IBM. Linux Mint could not. Debian could not. The thousands of community-maintained distributions that serve hundreds of millions of users worldwide, the distributions built by volunteers, maintained through community contribution, and distributed without commercial infrastructure, would be rendered illegal overnight, not because they are less secure, because they cannot afford the certification process that the law would require. And here is the part that reveals the commercial logic underneath the security framing. The companies whose products would automatically meet the certification requirements because they were written into the standards during the lobbying process are the same companies currently losing market share to Linux. Microsoft Windows would be certified. Apple Mac OS would be certified. The commercial operating systems whose vendors have the resources to participate in the regulatory process and the incentive to shape it in there. Favor would emerge from certification requirements stronger than before. Linux, in its most accessible and community-driven forms, would effectively be criminalized, not through direct prohibition. Through compliance requirements that the open-source model structurally cannot meet, the $10 million fine is not the ceiling. In the most aggressive version of the proposed framework, penalties scale with the severity and duration of the non-compliance. An enterprise running uncertified Linux across a server fleet for a year would face penalties that dwarf the cost of migrating to a certified alternative. A small business owner running Linux, Mint on their office machines, would face penalties that could exceed the value of their entire business. The financial deterrent is designed to be so overwhelming that compliance becomes the only rational choice regardless of technical merit. The individual user running Linux at home occupies a legally ambiguous space in most versions of this framework. Consumer devices are sometimes treated differently from commercial deployments, but the ambiguity itself is a tool. When the legal risk of running an uncertified operating system is undefined, the rational response for most users is to avoid the risk entirely. You do not need to prosecute home Linux users to push them back to Windows. You just need the threat to be credible enough that the uncertainty feels dangerous. The European Union's Cyber Resilience Act provides the real-world regulatory template that makes this scenario more than theoretical. The CRA, which passed in 2024, imposes security requirements on software products sold in the European market. The initial drafts of the CRA were so broadly written that open-source software distributed without commercial transaction would have been subject to the same compliance requirements as commercial products. The open-source community mobilized an extraordinary lobbying response. The final version of the CRA included exemptions for non-commercial open-source development. Those exemptions were won. They were not given. And the next version of the CRA, or the equivalent legislation in other jurisdictions, may not include them. The regulatory pressure on open-source software is not a single battle. It is a sustained campaign being fought every time a new cybersecurity law is drafted, every time a certification standard is updated, every time a procurement requirement is written. Each individual fight can be won. The cumulative pressure of fighting every fight forever, while simultaneously building and maintaining. The software is a resource asymmetry that favors the well-funded side. The people most affected by this regulatory pressure are not the Linux developers at Red Hat or Canonical, who have legal teams and government affairs departments. They are the users. The retired teachers who just switched to Linux Mint to escape the Windows tax, the small business owners running Ubuntu servers to avoid Microsoft licensing fees, the privacy-conscious individuals running hardened Linux systems to protect themselves from the exact surveillance infrastructure that proprietary operating systems have been documented running. Those users have no lobbying budget. They have no government affairs department. They have the open source community's advocacy organizations, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, the Software Freedom Conservancy, the Free Software Foundation, organizations that do extraordinary work with genuinely limited resources against opponents with effectively unlimited ones. The argument that this cannot happen because Linux is too important to the Internet's infrastructure misunderstands how regulatory capture works. The data centers running the world's Internet infrastructure run Linux. The servers that power every major cloud provider run Linux. The routers that move Internet traffic run Linux. None of that matters if the law being written applies specifically to desktop operating systems on consumer and commercial endpoint devices, which is exactly where the commercial pressure is focused, because that is where Microsoft and Apple's consumer revenue lives. Server Linux and desktop Linux can be treated as separate categories under a single regulatory framework. The former can be left largely untouched because it serves the interests of the cloud providers who also have lobbying budgets. The latter can be regulated into commercial irrelevance because that is where the lost market share is coming from. What needs to happen is straightforward, even if it is not easy. The open source community, the Linux user base, and every organization that depends on open source software for its operations needs to treat every cybersecurity regulation proposal as a potential existential threat to software freedom until proven otherwise. The default assumption cannot be that well-intentioned security legislation will naturally protect open-source software. The default assumption must be that it will not, because the evidence from every major regulatory process of the last decade supports that assumption. Read the proposals. Respond to the consultations. Support the advocacy organizations. Make the cost of regulatory capture visible before the law passes rather than after. The $10 million fine is not inevitable, but it is possible. Impossible is close enough to real that treating it as someone else's problem is a decision you may not get to revisit. The freedom to choose your operating system is not a technical preference. It is a legal right that exists only as long as no law removes it. That law is being written right now. Drop your take below.